what I want to do is introduce to you the videotape, which is the first in a series of videotapes by Shauna Halevi on the genius of Albert Einstein. This is a production that really comes out of the fact that in the LaRouche youth movement, under LaRouche's guidance, and Sean is a part of the team, he has a group of youth who are focused on bringing about a scientific revolution by redeveloping the methods that led to great scientific discoveries in the past, and that were part of a single unified idea of the creative nature of mankind. There's a nice irony in that Einstein stood for this through his entire life as a moral, scientific, cultural, and political fight. Even in the latter part of his years when he was considered a pariah for not accepting the new science that was irrational, that rejected the idea of a unified universe. Einstein himself, who came out of the great German Weimar classical culture, was steeped through his family in people like Schiller and Heine, also was steeped in the scientific outlook of people like Bernhard Riemann, Gauss, and harked back to Kepler. And when he specifically rejected the Newtonian outlook and went to Kepler, Gauss, and ultimately Riemann, whom he had to rediscover to be able to complete his scientific work. And he fought for that every step of the way. This is the view of mankind that has produced all of the developments that are progressive, that mean real anti-entropic development in human history. And so it's quite appropriate that Shauna, as part of the LaRouche youth movement, is looking at a figure like Einstein to exemplify the quality of mind, the quality of person as an integral whole that's required to allow humanity to progress further out of these otherwise troubled times. So we're inviting you to take a view and a look at science and culture through the eyes of Albert Einstein, his violin, his sense of what humanity is, and the fight that he waged, through which he himself kept alive the minds of Kepler, Gauss, Riemann, Mozart, and many others. And he kept it alive for us, and now for this youth movement, to forward the very discoveries that he made. What they're looking at now is creating a unified picture of action and scientific and anti-entropic development in the universe as a whole, bringing together what Vernadsky calls the biotic, the prebiotic, and the cognitive, and using that to make the very same quality of discoveries and beyond that people like Einstein, Planck, Riemann, and others made. So this is something we invite you to view, to be able yourself to not only comprehend these kinds of developments, these kinds of personalities, but recognize that this is part of who you are.
Do you remember asking the big questions? What is the meaning of life? Where does the universe end? What does it mean that we are going to die? How do I know what is right and what is wrong? Is it merely relative? What is truth? How is it that I can think about me thinking? Why did you stop asking these questions? Did you grow up and then find the answers? Or did you give up? These are difficult questions, but some say only the difficult matters are worth our attention. In the following series of videos, we hope to reignite or reaffirm in many people the human quality of youthfully pursuing knowledge and the moral courage needed for that. The example of Albert Einstein will provide us with a generous friend to help pursue some essential questions, starting with, what is the nature of man? Mankind as a species is distinguished from lower forms of life by a creative impulse to fulfill future missions for improvement of our progeny's existence in our universe. The meaning of one's life is determined by the commitment to this immortal mission. Individual creative discovery, the search for truth, is driven by the joy and passion that comes from the commitment to mankind's advancement. Progress is morality. When this sacred devotion is absent, evil, such as the British financial empire of London and Wall Street, stalks and seeks to snuff out this light through mental slavery, war, economic crises, and genocide. Our citizenry needs to be intellectually and emotionally equipped to combat this. There is a demand for individuals self-conscious and determined enough to lead and take responsibility to willfully develop society. Politically, the question of an international Glass-Steagall and a short-term goal of a colony on Mars puts this squarely on the table. How, as a culture, do we accomplish this? Let us introduce our friend as a case study. To understand Einstein's mind, his genius, we must know the culture he came from, the unseen tradition he was a part of.
If you look at universal history over long arcs, one can actually see that there were only relatively few periods in history where mankind really progressed. And I would underline maybe three periods as absolutely outstanding. One was naturally the Greek classical period, which sort of was the cradle of European culture. Then you had a long dark age, only interrupted with developments in China, in India. But the next time there was really a massive period of progress was the Italian Renaissance. And then the next major period of development was the German classical period.
By returning to conceptions of classical Greece and reviving Shakespeare, Germany was able to make a leap forward in the evolution of humanity, representing the highest development in human culture to this day. Musical composition and other arts reach its most elevated expression with Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, the Schumanns and Mendelssohns, not to mention the poetry of Heine and the drama of Schiller.
Then if you look at the philosophical development, which emanated really from the ideas of Leibniz, who revived the great tradition of Cusa and Kepler, Leibniz's conception about the harmony of the human soul and the laws of the universe was laying the foundation for a lot of great developments, both in art and in science, to follow.
Some of the followers of Leibniz, such as Kästner, Moses Mendelssohn, and Lessing, fought for the most lofty ideals of mankind in Germany. Ideals like the American conception that all men are created equal.
This German classical period, which you had, both in music but also in literature, in poetry, was really a potential threat to the dominance of the oligarchical system over Europe. Because Schiller, who was the beloved poet of this period, he had this idea that every man can become a genius. Every human being has the potential of becoming totally unique and contributing something absolutely unique to human civilization.
Schiller organized the intellectual and political leaders of Germany to implement these ideas as policy in all realms of life. One of his friends, the famous Wilhelm von Humboldt, turned Schiller's image of the beautiful character into an educational system, where the aim of education was the method of learning, not just learning specifics.
Nowadays, people worry a lot about their beautiful body or their beautiful outlook or their beautiful this or that, but to think about the beauty of your soul, that is not very fashionable these days. But Schiller's conception about a beautiful soul was simply the idea that men can only be free when freedom and necessity, duty and passion are really the same thing. In other words, that only if you do joyfully and passionately what is necessary, that you are free.
These sort of enduring objects of thought were nurtured, advanced, and passed on by small pockets of society that can influence the entire culture. Another tool of Schiller's to attain real freedom was the study of this true history.
Because only if you can locate your own identity in the long chain of generations of your entire nation and universal history, can you find your place of identity in such a way.
Einstein's Germany at the turn of the century was a world center for culture and science, which made it a hub for achievements and attacks. Politically, Germany in the 1880s was reaping the radiating effect of the U.S. defeat of the British with the centennial celebration of 1876. Bismarck had unified Germany as a single nation, introducing social reforms. Industry, as exemplified by the Rathenhaus, was blooming. Science and culture had a new opportunity to thrive.
Germany was not a nation in the 1850s, early 1860s. It included up to 150, 200 city-states, principalities, dukedoms. When Bismarck took over, and then when Prussia unified all of Germany, the political unification took place, but economic unification still was going to take a bit of time.
With the appointment of Bismarck as Chancellor in 1862, Germany could become a single modern nation. However, even after unification, Germany was still dominated by British economic practice and was faced with an economic speculative bubble, which resulted in a deep depression in 1875.
Between 76 and 79, Bismarck conducted a political and an economic revolution, which led to the adoption in 1879 of protectionism, tariffs.
The model of the American system with credit from a national bank was used to encourage industry, protect farming, and integrate Germany through a national railway project. 1876 represented a turning point with the American Centennial Celebration, which was attended by German representatives. This provided the needed inspiration to pull out from under the suppression of production by the British, who used cheap labor to flood the economy with cheap goods, stifling industry and bankrupting farmers.
So in 1879, when Bismarck enacted the tariffs, all of a sudden everything was in place for an incredible economic explosion. And this was a real industrial revolution. Germany overnight, within a decade, surpassed Britain as the world's leading power in terms of steel production. So Germany went into an incredible economic expansion.
While Britain was still in the early 1800s in terms of production, Germany was applying breakthroughs in chemistry to improve its technologies and the standard of living of its population. This, of course, would have political reactions from the financial empire of the world. The British oligarchy feared that a unified Germany would be a political opponent to their domination of world trade.
Bismarck was ousted in 1890 as part of a long-term British operation to get rid of him, because he was the key figure. He had a vision of a nation, of unity of interest between agriculture and industry. This was the idea of the American Revolution, the harmony of interests of Henry Carey. Bismarck's social reforms then in 1883 really demonstrated the difference between that kind of approach and the Manchester free trade approach of Britain, which required an industrial workforce that was poor and lived off the crumbs of the empire. The idea that industry would create a workforce that would have some leisure time, that could go out into the beautiful German countryside on the weekend, that had paid days off. All of this was new in the world. And that added to this sense of a real potential for an unlimited potential. And that's what was attacked.
The threat of Bismarck's economic reforms, making Germany a springboard for the development of all Europe, unifying it with Central Asia through a proposed Berlin to Baghdad railroad, was no different from his social reforms. New ideas such as retirement and unemployment allowed a population to develop their minds. The optimism of the American system was flourishing. The state of German culture was shaped by the individuals like Otto von Bismarck and Friedrich List, who were able to step outside the culture and give it top-down leadership, reordering the potential for action and thought for people within the culture. A reciprocal relation occurs between the leaders going against the popular current and the whole society changing in response to that, which creates an environment for new leaders to be born. Albert Einstein was born in 1879 in Ulm, Germany, slightly more than a decade before the British ousted Bismarck in fear of the American system taking hold worldwide. Einstein's mother, Pauline, was a patient woman with a sound wit. She loved music and played the piano splendidly. His father, Hermann Einstein, ran an electrical business with his brother. Hermann was endowed with an unfailing goodness of heart and a contemplative nature. He loved literature, and in the evenings would read Schiller and Heine by lamplight to the family.
Worn down by the monotonous, often oppressive affairs of daily life, and bombarded by sensuality, man necessarily feels an inner emptiness which clashes with his eternal desire for activity. Human nature cannot bear the uninterrupted and eternal rack of daily business, and sensual excitement simply dies with its own gratification. Man, overwrought by animal enjoyments, fatigued from protracted labors, tormented by his eternal compulsion to remain active, thirsts for better and more select amusement.
As a youth, Einstein became disenchanted with the animal-like drive of everyday life.
When I was a fairly precocious young man, I became thoroughly impressed with the futility of the hopes and strivings that chase most men restlessly through life. Moreover, I soon discovered the cruelty of that chase. By the mere existence of his stomach, everyone was condemned to participate in that chase. The stomach might well be satisfied by such participation, but not man, insofar as he is a thinking and a feeling being.
Einstein first sought for something higher in existence through religion. Something more substantial, more universal had to be out there. Writing his own songs of praise to God, at an early age he took it upon himself to observe religious practice, such as dietary commandments, in spite of his irreligious Jewish family.
Individual existence impresses him as a sort of prison, and he wants to experience the universe as a single significant whole. To sense that behind anything that can be experienced there is a something that our mind cannot grasp, and whose beauty and sublimity reaches us only indirectly and as a feeble reflection, this is religiousness.
Soon, religion took another shape. From reading popular science books at the age of 12, Einstein saw that the Bible stories could not be true, and he developed a mistrust of every authority. In physical science, he saw a new way to pursue a greater purpose in life.
The religious paradise of youth was a first attempt to free myself from the chains of the merely personal, from an existence dominated by wishes, hopes, and primitive feelings. Out yonder there was this huge world, which exists independently of us human beings, and which stands before us like a great eternal riddle, partially accessible to our inspection and thinking. The contemplation of this world beckoned as a liberation, and presented itself to my mind as a supreme goal. Similarly motivated men of the present and of the past were the friends who could not be lost. The road to this paradise was not as comfortable and alluring as the road to the religious paradise, but it has shown itself reliable, and I have never regretted having chosen it.
Einstein's curiosity for unseen powers of the out yonder was provoked when his father showed him a magnetic compass. How strange that something that couldn't be touched was pulling on this needle.
Wonder appears to occur when an experience comes into conflict with a world of concepts already sufficiently fixed within us. A wonder of this kind I experienced as a child of 4 or 5 years when my father showed me a compass. That this needle behaved in such a determined way did not at all fit into the kind of occurrences that could find a place in the unconscious world of concepts. I can still remember that this experience made a deep and lasting impression upon me. Something deeply hidden had to be behind things.
We see some of what influenced Einstein in his early youth. Think of this young mind contemplating unseen and immaterial forces like that of the magnetic compass. It's like staring at the wide expanse of the horizon of the ocean, or the countless stars in the nighttime sky. You don't know where to begin. Because it cannot be visualized in its entirety, it's not quantifiable by the usual means of measure and thought. There's a sense of awe at the infinite.
We take delight in sensuous, infinite objects because we can think what the senses can no longer grasp and what the understanding no longer comprehends. And so nature has used the sensuous means to teach us that we are more than sensuous. We are not slaves subjected to the violence of sensations. The physical and moral man are differentiated here in the most striking manner, for it is precisely in such objects where the physical man feels his limits and the moral man experiences his power. The moral man is infinitely uplifted by the very thing which crushes the physical man to the ground.
At the age of 16, Einstein had an epiphany reflecting on Bismarck's famous motto that beer makes one stupid and lazy. Einstein vowed to become a theoretical physicist and henceforth become intoxicated on physics. This was the time at which Einstein started contemplating the unique nature of light, thoughts which resolved into the theory of special relativity. His intellectual curiosity not being satisfied by the German education system, which he believed deadened the free spirit through militaristic rote, he followed his family to Milan. Italy was a paradise of beautiful landscape, where he studied for the first time classical visual art, such as Leonardo da Vinci. Soon, he had to leave to Switzerland to finish up his schooling and attend college. This is where he settled down to become a clerk at a patent office in Bern. The essence of someone's being lies in what they think and how they think, not simply in a biography of what they did. As we will see, Einstein's entire scientific career was a byproduct of his commitment to a higher, more meaningful reality. He never set out to simply solve a paradox. All his discoveries were only evidence obtained to test and come to know reality as a whole. How many people do we know whose one goal is to retire? What's driving them to make even one accomplishment or contribution to society, let alone many, with the only personal gain being the joy of being human? Through the unifying of electromagnetism and mechanics and special relativity, to a new theory of gravity based on the Riemannian curvature of space and general relativity, Einstein was always taking steps forward in the ultimate effort to create a unified field theory, a model to account for the microcosm and astrophysical effects of the world. Each of Einstein's revelations were not achievements to rest on, They were the overthrowing of previous conceptions that held him back from breaking further ground, a type of non-linear evolution of thought. It's as if someone is digging a hole through a mountain to see what's on the other side, but they keep finding gold nuggets along the way. His discoveries were merely necessary accidents along the path to a higher goal of a theory of the world with the most simplicity that yet still relates as many different kinds of phenomena as possible. We best know Einstein for his work on relativity in physics, yet he worked in many branches of physical science, working in chemistry, studying biology, showing the existence and dimensions of atoms, investigating the nature of heat and other radiation, all cracks through which to view the final causes of the world. As a hunter who never settles for this or that animal, but is more interested in the art of hunting for that which you don't yet know.
It is open to every man to choose the direction of his striving. And also, every man may draw comfort from Lessing's fine saying that the search for truth is more precious than its possession.
In conversation with a young physicist expressing her desire to go to Paris for a change in surroundings, Einstein said, "I never look for that. I like Paris, but I don't want to go there, or anywhere. I don't like to learn a new language. I don't like new food or new clothes. I'm not much with people, and I'm not a family man. I want my peace. I want to know how God created this world. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know His thoughts. The rest are details. This hunt for God's thoughts lies outside the realm of mathematics and requires a certain instinct."
The fact that I neglected mathematics to a certain extent had its cause not merely in my stronger interest in the natural sciences than in mathematics, but also in the following peculiar experience. I saw that mathematics was split up into numerous specialties, each of which could easily absorb the short lifetime granted to us. Consequently, I saw myself in the position of Buridan's ass, which was unable to decide upon any particular bundle of hay. Also, my interest in the study of nature was no doubt stronger. True enough, physics also was divided into separate fields, each of which was capable of devouring a short lifetime of work without having satisfied the hunger for deeper knowledge. In this field, however, I soon learned to scent out that which might lead to fundamentals, and to turn aside from everything else, from the multitude of things that cluttered up the mind and diverted it from the essentials.
When Einstein is stalking a universal principle or a law of nature, an animal that has not been known to exist yet, there is no logical mode or formula of operation. Nothing can be predicted from experience. Insight can hit in a flash. It's as if being aware of a relation existing without knowing what it is. It won't let him quit. He's driven to seek out something, a pathway, he knows must exist, even though he's never experienced it.
Nobody who has really gone deeply into the matter will deny that in practice, the world of phenomena uniquely determines the theoretical system. The fact that there is no logical bridge between phenomena and their theoretical principles, this is what Leibniz describes so happily as a pre-established harmony.
What guides you over this non-logical gap between what the senses tell you and theory? How do you come to know the world? All the pieces are there, but do you have the hypothesis to draw a discovery from them? What's the sufficient reason why certain facts are one way and not another? In short, how do we come to a theory with the least amount of arbitrariness? Einstein would say that the connection between the empirically given, the realm of what we observe, to the conceptual world, the ideas and theories we use to come to understand them, is purely intuitive. that there's no logical analysis to explain how the mind understands the world outside of it. Therefore, imagination is more important than knowledge. The mark of Einstein's unique personality and of how he thought can be expressed by his epistemological credo. There are two domains, one of the totality of concepts, the other of perceptions. Concepts only get their meaning through their connection to experience. Though this linkage is entirely intuitive, it's what separates scientific truth from fantasy. The structure of this conceptual system is a human creation, and its aim is to make a complete coordination with the totality of experiences, providing a glimpse of the marvelous structure of the world, and it is devoted to comprehend a portion of the reason that manifests itself in nature. Einstein's view of the universe and of the ethical society came from embracing the world, taking the infinite inside himself, forming the concept of the objective world as a one, in himself as a separate individual, like an outside participant of a drama. When he sees what's lacking in the material world, he strives to ennoble it to the ideal. Therefore, the science of Einstein's creativity lies not in mathematics, as how most people think of science, as some logically deductive system of a computer, but lies in a sense which is not sight, nor hearing, nor any other bodily organ. It lies in insight, a type of smell of what you cannot see or touch. An experiment is what you use to test and validate this insight, to show it as a reliable sense. There are an infinity of sense perceptions at any given moment, a confused, indifferent mosaic. The mind is that which provides the organizing element which gives definite wholes to this sequence to account for the generation. Einstein knew that because sense perceptions cannot give you reality, reality lies in the imagination. By striving to comprehend the universal as Einstein did, you get a sense of the reason or beauty of certain things. A type of resonance occurs between the principles ordering the universe and the innate ability of your mind. As a starting point, we will look at the theory of special relativity in this first chapter to get a glimpse at the method of insight Einstein had on life and science. The realm of science was in major flux during Einstein's youth. The discovery of radioactivity and other new phenomena made for an open environment. Röntgen's X-rays in 1895, Becquerel and the Curies on radiation in the 1890s, J.J. Thomson with the discovery of electrons in 1897, Pasteur earlier with work opening the field of microbiology to Gurvitch, Mendeleev's creation of the periodic table leading to breakthroughs in physical chemistry and medicine, Hertz's measurement of the speed of an electromagnetic wave being that of the constant speed of light, Max Planck with his investigation of heat radiation at the turn of the century had put physics in a crisis. After nearly 200 years, Newton's mechanics, which was to suppress the real history of the science of motion of Leibniz, was clashing with another cover-up job by Maxwell and others of the true development of the electromagnetic field theory of Gauss, Weber, and Riemann. Newton's scheme of motion based on instantaneous action at a distance through empty space by a force primarily determined by a mass, by its nature did not fit with Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism. Maxwell's equations operated on the foundation that the combined action of electricity and magnetism propagated in a wave motion at the speed of light, through an immaterial medium, an energy field, without mass. If only they could keep their lies straight, a stupefied population wouldn't have known the difference, since the explanation of physics derived from these theories so well match up with our everyday experiences. There seems to be empty space between objects of mass. Our eyes don't see anything in between. When we bounce a ball, it seems to have an immediate reaction. And who could argue with Maxwell, since he is describing something which we cannot see?
To start with, the theory of relativity is not something that was original to Einstein. Einstein was not the first person to use this term. The idea of something being relative or relational or comparative, this has a long history. For example, you have something called the relativity of motion, where according to one person, they can consider themselves stationary and another person in motion, where the opposite could be viewed from the person who is thought to be in motion. They can think that you are actually moving and they are stationary. Simple relativity of motion. I should prepare a video for you guys to see this idea. So here we have some friends. Here's Leona. In relation to us, she's moving. So from our perspective, Leona is moving to the left. But from her perspective, it's all of us, or in this case, the cameraman, who's moving while she's stationary. Her body's not moving. So who's right in this case?
Leona.
Who's actually in motion? Both of them would be able to argue that they are stationary and the other one is in motion. And this is a simple idea of the relativity of motion. Who's stationary and who's in uniform motion? A consequence of this is that the laws of motion, the laws of mechanics, are true no matter if you're stationary or if you're in uniform motion. Meaning that there's no experiment in mechanics, in the laws of mechanics, that will indicate to you that you're in motion, that you're in uniform motion. So try as you might come up with any experiment you can think of using mechanics, you're not going to be able to indicate or prove to yourself that you are the one who's actually in motion. What this means is that all laws of mechanics are going to be true, are going to be viewed the same way, no matter your reference frame, whether you're stationary or in uniform motion. So it seems that the laws of mechanics don't have a preference to how they're viewed. The laws of mechanics don't make it necessary that you have to be in a particular reference frame to view them. There's no ultimate reference frame from which they have to be viewed. There's no ultimate rest nor ultimate motion. For example, again, this is Leona looking at Newton's cradle while standing still. So all the laws of mechanics involved in Newton's cradle, inertia, action, reaction, mass, force, height, turning into velocity, are all being observed. Now, when she steps onto a moving walkway and uses the Newton cradle, she again observes the same laws. So she's not able to tell, using this mechanical device, whether or not she's in motion. We'll see those two instances together. One stationary, one in motion. In both cases, the law of mechanics are viewed the same. So from the standpoint of mechanics, there's no preferred reference frame. There's no ultimate box that they are measuring themselves against. There's no origin, some point in the universe from which they gauge themselves. But instead they are viewed the same way from whichever reference frame you choose to be in, whether you're stationary or in uniform motion. So it's pretty interesting. A consequence of this is something called the addition of velocity, where from Leona's perspective, when she walks onto the moving walkway, she has a certain velocity to herself, but then all of a sudden the rest of the room around her starts moving in the opposite direction with another velocity. But from an outside observer, from our cameraman, it's not the case that the entire building is moving, but it's simply that her velocity was added to the moving walkway. And I'll play that for you. So Leona has a beginning velocity while walking pretty steady, slow. And then as she steps onto the moving walkway, her velocity is increased by the velocity of the moving walkway. Except from her perspective, she's still going the same speed. Here's a side view. In comparison to the speed that she began at, she sped up once she stepped onto the walkway. And that's just a simple addition of velocity. This is going to become important later on, even though it seems like a simple idea. Here's a cartoon. So here's a guy on a Segway. He's going velocity V. But as you pull out, from our perspective on the beach, he's actually moving on an aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier's velocity is W. So, from our perspective, the man on the Segway is not simply going the velocity V, but he's going V plus W. His velocity on the Segway plus the velocity on the of the aircraft carrier. This is a consequence of maintaining the relativity of motion. So that's a brief history for you of this idea of relativity. That there's been an idea of the relativity of motion for a while before Einstein. What Einstein added to this was it seems lawful that all the laws of mechanics are going to be able to be viewed equally whether you're stationary or in uniform motion. That they're not going to change just because you're in motion. But what about the rest of the laws of nature? Are they going to be maintained? Are they going to be able to be viewed equally whether you're stationary or in motion? For example, Leona wanted to test this out. So are people familiar with a solenoid? Do you know what it is? You have a magnet going in and out of a tube which is wrapped in wire. And the motion of the magnet induces an electric current. This is her playing with it stationary, standing still. When she steps onto the moving walkway, is the solenoid still going to work, or are the laws of electromagnetism going to change? A lawful follow-up to our idea of the relativity of mechanics. Will all of nature's laws be maintained whether we are stationary or in uniform motion? So Einstein pondered this for a while as he was a kid. And one of the questions he pondered over was, what about light? If I chase after a ray of light, is its velocity in relation to me chasing after it going to decrease? And if I chase after it long enough, if I manage to catch up with it, will it no longer be moving? As if two cars on a highway, relative to a police officer standing on the side of the highway, they have two different speeds. Say one's 30 miles an hour, another 60 miles an hour. But to the perspective of the person in the car going 30 miles an hour, the car in front of him going 60 is merely going 30 miles an hour more than him. In his reference frame, the second vehicle is going 30 miles an hour, even though to the police officer standing off onto the side, it's actually going 60. So is that going to also happen to a ray of light, being a consequence of the addition or the subtraction of velocities? If you chase after a ray of light, will its velocity decrease as yours increases? And will you eventually catch up with it? If you're the two cars on the highway and you eventually end up at the same speed as each other, both going 60, if you turn and look to the other passengers in the car, they seem stationary. It seems as if both the cars are parked, just looking at each other. So to Einstein, this was a puzzling idea. What would light do if you chased after it, and if you caught up with it? Would it all of a sudden stand still? So here we have two police officers. One on the left, both of them have clocks and speed guns, speedometers. The one on the left is going to clock the speed of the police officer on the right. The one on the right is going to clock the speed of a culprit. A ray of light. So, as the police officer increases his speed, as perceived from the stationary police officer, the more chubby guy, the speed of the ray of light is decreasing. And now we have space travel. And now he's at an equal speed with the ray of light. So we laugh. It's a funny thought to be chasing after a ray of light, for it to decrease its speed as you catch up with it, and then for it to appear stationary, whatever a ray of light would look like stationary. While to the police officer who stayed behind, for good reason, would see the ray of light at its constant velocity of 186,000 miles per second. So this was a difficult situation for Einstein. It seems in the law of mechanics that there is no absolute rest, that all motion is relative. But to the laws of optics or electromagnetism, there seems to be an absolute rest, unless that being the velocity of light, the constant velocity of light, maintaining that there's some absolute rest somewhere in which it's being measured by. And if we were to change the velocity of light and say, no, the situation for light is going to be similar for the situation of mechanics, that all motion is relative, and that your velocities are going to change in relation to each other, then the velocity of light is no longer constant, but your laws of optics, your laws of electromagnetism, which act at the speed of light, are now changing. They're no longer laws. So this was very puzzling for Einstein. He didn't know what could give. He didn't want to doubt the constancy of the speed of light, because then you would lose all the laws and all the facts that we've learned from experiments of electromagnetism and of optics. But he didn't want to assume that there was, or to not to assume, but to compromise and come to the conclusion that there was some absolute rest, some point in the universe that acted as an origin to the speed of light. He didn't want to have to come to that conclusion. So, in order to resolve this difficulty, he said, let's just set up a simple experiment. If the velocity of light changes in relation to your motion, then with an experiment, you'll be able to detect whether or not you're moving. Where with the Newton's cradle or any other mechanical experiment, we're not able to determine whether or not we're in uniform motion, because the laws of mechanics are going to act the same whether you're stationary or whether you're in uniform motion. So there's no law, or there's no experiment in mechanics to indicate to you whether you're in motion or stationary. But if the speed of light is going to change in relation to your motion, then you can set up an experiment using that to determine whether or not you're stationary or in motion. So if we can come up with a precise experiment, we'll be able to determine if the velocity of light is relative, then it'll change when it's in a system that's in motion, or whether or not it's constant and the laws of electromagnetism are maintained. Einstein found out later that there was an experiment like this set up, the Michelson-Morley experiment. We got a chance to replicate the experiment. So you have a light source, 3 mirrors, one in the middle which is half silvered, so it allows half of the ray of light to continue in its forward direction, and the other half to be reflected by this 45-degree angled mirror perpendicularly to the other ray of light. The other 2 mirrors are placed equidistant from the center mirror, so that the 2 rays of light will be split in the middle, reflect off of their 2 targets, and be collected back into this interferometer here in the left corner. The interferometer is used to measure the interference waves of the 2 rays of light, whether they're in sync or whether they are off rhythm from each other. So the experiment wouldn't seem to do much, since 2 rays of light are just traveling the same distance. But in this experiment, the whole apparatus is in motion. We're going to test whether or not motion of the source of light affects the speed of light. The motion that this apparatus is in is the motion of the Earth. It's moving with the motion of the Earth. The direction of one of the mirrors is placed in the direction of the motion of the Earth, the other one being vertical or perpendicular to that. So that if the velocity of light is affected, if its velocity is added or subtracted to the motion of the Earth, it should be out of sync with the other ray of light that travels the same distance but is not affected by the motion of the Earth. I would say thank you to the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories for reconducting this experiment for us, but it was done right here in the office. So the distance BD is equal to the distance BC, and both rays of light are then collected at point E to be analyzed. So let me give an analogy quickly of what this experiment is trying to determine. This might be far out for people to follow, but bear with me. We have a very large treadmill. It's 4 by 4 meters big. This is a treadmill. And the 4 by 4 treadmill is going at a speed of 3 meters per second. Now we're going to have 2 runners run in directions perpendicular to each other on this treadmill. Both of the runners will be running at equal velocity, or both the runner speeds will be equal. Let me make sure I'm clear on this. So, direction of the treadmill is going in this direction, going in the direction left. If a runner is to, instead of running up the treadmill, runs across it, don't try this at home, and say he reaches the opposite side in 1 second. He didn't simply travel 4 meters. If he would have merely ran straight, would have fallen off the treadmill. So he has to run at an oblique angle to end up at the target directly in front of him. Which means as he runs up, the treadmill takes him to the left. So he has to run a little bit extra than just 4 meters. So in 1 second, the treadmill takes him 3 meters down. He's trying to run to a target that's 4 meters in front of him. So how many meters does he actually have to run?
5.
Yes, he actually has to run 5 meters to make it to this target. So in 1 second, he runs 5 meters. And then how long is it going to take him to turn around and run back to where he started? If it took him 1 second to run across to one side.
Should be the same.
Should be the same, yes. He'll run another 5 meters in 1 second. So if our second runner has the same speed of 5 meters per second, and he runs for 2 seconds, as our first runner did, 1 second, and then a second back, the second runner will run 10 meters in 2 seconds. But meanwhile, as the second runner was running up the treadmill was taking him down each second. So how many meters will the treadmill take him down in 2 seconds? How many meters will the treadmill pull him back?
6.
6. So in 2 seconds, the second runner running at 5 meters per second would have ran 10 meters, except the treadmill took him back 6 meters. So in 2 seconds, he makes it where?
1 meter?
To the end.
You got it, Hector. Yeah, to the end, 4 meters. In 2 seconds, he can run 10 meters, but the treadmill has taken him back 6 meters in 2 seconds. So in 2 seconds, he merely makes it to the end of the treadmill. He hasn't made it back yet. Where the first runner has made it to the end of the treadmill, across the treadmill, and back in 2 seconds. This is the analogy that Michelson experiment was trying to do with light. The treadmill motion being the motion of the Earth. If a ray of light is traveling against the motion of the Earth and then back again, we would expect its velocity to be different than a ray of light that just has to travel the same distance but across. So we would expect them to be out of sync with each other. So let's look again at the Michelson-Morley experiment. So just to make the Michelson-Morley experiment clear, we did a pulse of light. So at the light source, a beam of light is released, it's split into half, 2 equal parts. They travel the same distance, are reflected back, and collected into the interferometer. One of the mirrors are placed in the direction of Earth's motion. The other is vertical to it. So one ray of light is expected to be affected by the velocity of Earth. And with our precise instrument here, the interferometer, precise instrument to the left, we should be able to detect any interference between the two waves of the rays of light. So is our experiment clear? The way we're going to be able to detect whether the motion of a source affects the velocity of light? Because remember what our paradox was. Either the relativity of motion is maintained for light, meaning that the same situation that happens in the laws of mechanics, where they are unaffected whether they're in motion, in uniform motion, or whether they are stationary. Either that situation is also true for the other laws of nature, such as electromagnetism, or the velocity of light changes given the motion of its source. But then if you say the velocity of light changes given the motion of its source, which would be a consequence of the relativity of motion, what we spoke of earlier of the addition of velocity, or you could say the subtraction of velocity, that being a simple consequence of the relativity of motion. If you say the velocity of light changes because of the relativity of motion, you're saying that the law of the constancy of light is not true if it's put into motion. So it kind of breaks down. Because remember, Einstein's question was, is there a relativity for all of nature's laws? Not simply for the laws of mechanics, but will all of nature's laws be maintained given motion in a uniform manner, or if you're stationary, if you're viewing them from a stationary reference frame? So this precise experiment of the Michelson-Morley should have settled that. But for most physicists at that time, 1880s, and this experiment was performed for decades, over and over again, more and more precise instruments at different heights, at different depths, different locations, different times of the year, different angles. It still baffled scientists that there was no interference between the two rays of light. It's what was called the null result. There was no difference, the arrival times, of either ray of light. So for Einstein, this wasn't necessarily surprising. What was surprising was, what was he taking for granted that made him expect the reverse? What in this experiment is being overlooked that makes us surprised by its results? So he rolled it over in his mind. Said it's a pretty clear setup. I understand what the task is. I understand what the components are. And I understand that the rays of light are received in the interferometer simultaneously. But do I really understand that? Do I understand what is meant by two events occurring simultaneously? And it seems clear enough if you think about two balls hitting the same target at the same time, two events occurring in the same place. That seems sort of clear of what simultaneous means in that situation. But what do we mean by something being simultaneous in different locations? What do we mean by something occurring in this room and another event occurring somewhere else in the world simultaneously? What do we mean by that? So Einstein in his book asks his readers to consider this carefully. How would you set up an experiment to test a conception that you're so comfortable with? Because for a physicist, no conception is acceptable unless you have a method to experiment with it, to test it, to prove it. You can't just simply say, oh, it's obvious, can't you see? You have to be able to define it in a way that gives you a method to test it. So he sets up a thought experiment where you have an observer standing in a grassy field as maglev zooms by. And at the moment that the observer is facing the middle of the train, 2 bolts of lightning strike either end of the train. And to the observer, he says it happens simultaneously. So here's our observer in the field. So lightning's pretty fast. Yes, our friend Motoki risked his life for science to test his hypothesis of simultaneity. So when we asked Motoki to be more clear about what he saw, can you, in a less confused manner, tell us what you observed? Sure, you tell us that the bolts of lightning are simultaneous, but how could you prove that? How do you know that? And he says, well, okay, fine, I can prove that. I know they occurred simultaneously because when they occurred, I was in the middle of the train. My direction lined up with the middle of the train, and either bolt struck the ends of the train. And since my distance to each bolt of lightning was equal, and they travel at the same speed, both flashes of light reached me at the same time, meaning that when they traveled the same distance at the same velocity, they reached me at the same time. They had to occur at the same time. Okay, that's pretty precise. That we can test to experiment. But what about for an observer who's sitting on the middle of in the middle of the train, sitting in the train, in the middle car, and this same event happens? What are they going to see? The bolts of lightning are going to strike either end of the train. Each bolt of lightning has an equal distance to travel to reach the passenger inside the train. But what are they going to see? Here's our anonymous volunteer waiting patiently for their observation. So here's the front view of the train going forward and the rear view of the train, where each bolt of lightning is struck. So what does the passenger inside this train see? Would they say that the 2 bolts of lightning struck simultaneously? For them, the lightning bolt that they are approaching, the lightning bolt in the front end of the train occurs first. And the second bolt at the end of the train reaches them second. And if we were to ask them to explain their observation, they would give us a similar explanation of Motoki. I was sitting dead center in the train. The first the first flash of light and the second flash of light have an equal distance to travel to reach me. And since the velocity of light is equal, or since both flashes of light are traveling at the same velocity, I observed one flash first and a second flash, and the second flash after. Then, therefore, since they traveled the same distance at the same speed, the first bolt struck first, and the second bolt struck afterwards, according to my observations. So who are we going to trust in these 2 scenarios? It's the same event. Same train, same 2 bolts of lightning. One observer from the outside who's standing still says the event occurred simultaneously, the 2 events. Thank you, Motoki. The observer on the train argues otherwise. The conclusion that Einstein came to was that the velocity of light in each reference frame is constant. But instead, what is changing is the time that we're using to observe these events. Since we can't say that simultaneous events are something which is absolute, since the concept of simultaneity is not a true concept, no matter the observer's motion, since the idea of two events occurring at the same time depends on your observing position, it's not something absolute. It's not something we can use as a measure in any situation. The idea of simultaneity is something crucial to time. The way we measure the passage of time is by coordinating, for example, the ticking of hands on a clock. That each second is simultaneous with the click of a hand of a watch. So the idea of an absolute simultaneity is central to keeping time. And with this simple thought experiment, we see that simultaneity is not absolute. It changes given the reference frame of the observer, which is not such a bad thing. Time is not exactly a law of the universe, neither is distance. So Einstein saw that this paradox of the Michelson-Morley experiment, the idea that the velocity of light was not affected by the motion of the Earth, it's not so paradoxical when you drop your conception of an absolute time. That the contradictory ideas of the relativity of the laws of nature and the constancy of the velocity of light are no longer at odds with each other if you let go of another so-called absolute, that being time. If you relinquish the idea that time is some sort of absolute reference frame, then you're able to maintain the law of the speed of light and the laws of electromagnetism given uniform motion or a stationary observer. So instead of the velocity of light changing, it's your time that changes in reference to the velocity of light. And we can go back to our friend the police officer who's chasing after the speed of light. So same two police officers. One on the left is going to stay stationary. They're each equipped with identical clocks and speedometers, or speeding guns. The stationary cop is going to observe the speed of the running cop. And the running cop is going to observe the speed of the ray of light. The faster and faster this running cop goes, the velocity of light is not changing. So how is this possible? What is changing so that the law of the constancy of the speed of light is maintained? So, take a closer look. What's not changing? Well, the speed of light is not changing. And the stopwatch looks like it hasn't changed much. So in order for the moving reference frame to maintain the constancy of the velocity of light, his time changed. Amongst other things. So that the time for the speeding police officer is actually different from his stationary friend back on Earth. If they were to return and compare notes to write a report on this speeding ray of light, they would disagree with the occurrence, the times at which these events occurred. Yeah. The two eyewitnesses would disagree heavily. For one officer, the whole event took 15 minutes. For another, maybe about a minute. So in order for the laws of nature to be maintained, given the relative motion of the observers, you have to throw out your notion of a fixed time and also a fixed distance as a consequence of that. Which for a lot of people that they were very upset over this. But for Einstein, it made perfect sense. Why would something like a measurement on a clock be more primary than the experimentally proven constancy of the speed of light? The speed of light was something fundamental, in his view. It was something fundamental to electromagnetism, to science. So why would that take a secondary place to a stopwatch? He said, then look at the world with the question of the velocity of light. What is the world going to look like if we maintain the velocity of light as an invariant? How is the rest of the world going to shape itself around that principle? And that's when he was able to drop the conception of fixed time. At least, yeah, that far he was able to get. But we more and more have to get to that in a perpetual way. Always thinking about how the universe has to shape itself to principles. Because when we think of the world, we sometimes think of a box with objects in it. But it's actually inside out, that the universe is the principles which are containing the objects. And you use containing in a different sense now. It's not like a Tupperware container. But it's that these principles are bounding the objects which we interact with in a tangible sense. So that if you really want to interact with these tangible objects, you're going to act on that which is containing them. These principles, these processes. And you're going to start viewing the universe as inside out, in a sense, shaped by these principles. But when we say invariant, like when we're looking at the invariant velocity of light, we think of some fixed velocity. But that's not actually what the term invariant means. It doesn't mean, okay, we're dropping our idea of a fixed time and now making light fixed. You have to drop entirely your idea of what you think fixed means. That the principles that we say are invariant, that can be discovered no matter your perspective, whether you're stationary or in uniform motion, they're not something that's fixed. They're not something that you can constrain to a linear process. And then again, it's not something that you can say simply that they change. That they change in a regular, knowable way. It's the fact that they are a process which creates change that makes them invariant. And so it's not a fixed object in the way we used to think about time, but it's a process that generates these shadows. So the special theory of relativity says that all the laws of nature are going to be maintained, whether you're stationary or in uniform motion, not simply the laws of mechanics. So any experiment you conduct, given electromagnetism, optics, mechanics, you're not going to be able to detect whether or not you're stationary observing these phenomena or in uniform motion. So as we saw Leona earlier on the moving walkway, if she was to conduct more experiments, not just looking at Newton's cradle, but also then again, looking at the solenoid and different experiments in optics, she would not be able to detect whether or not she was stationary or in uniform motion. She would be able to still argue that, no, I'm stationary. Everybody else, including this whole building, is that which is moving in a uniform manner in the direction of my left. And I can prove it to you because, look, this experiment it indicates that it's being viewed from a stationary viewpoint. So, in the theory of special relativity, all the laws of nature are going to be equally observable from any reference frame. That there's no ultimate box from which you have to view the principles of nature. That they equally reveal themselves to anybody, whether they're stationary or in uniform motion. The only pitfall for some people is that your concept of an absolute time existing outside the universe, which is ticking by itself and can be used as a fixed measurement, that's what's actually changing, given your motion. So, you get a sense of what Lynn's brought up before of a type B identity, where the things that are most tangible, that seem most commonplace, most everyday, and almost absolute, almost unchanging, when viewed from a more principled standpoint, are actually the most fickle, the most variable things, such as time and distance. They are the things which are merely shadows or a dependence upon higher actions and processes, such as light and other principles in nature. A type of analogy to that, saying that the principles in nature are what are primary, and the measurements we take on a daily basis are what are secondary and variable and what changes. But that which is invisible, which is more difficult to detect from just mere observations, that's what's determining what you actually see. You can use this analogy in terms of social relations, in terms of cultural interactions. And it becomes more clear what Einstein was dealing with the principle of the velocity of light. In social relations, we have a changing perspective throughout our life, from when we are children to teenagers to adults, or even throughout the day, depending on your mood. If you had a bad meal or not a meal at all, or were stuck in traffic, you're gonna have a different perspective than if you had just woken up from a great night's rest. Or if a single person is the admiration of another person, but at the same time the mortal enemy of a third person, you see how there's complete different perspectives of the one and the same person. And you begin to wonder what those perspectives are based on. Are they based on something fickle and variable, which just happen to be the most easy to settle on, which are just observations on a daily basis that don't go any further to what's principled about the person? How do you resolve the paradox of one and the same person being viewed in a completely opposite way by two observers, by two reference frames? In one reference frame, the person is evil, or at least extremely obnoxious. In a different reference frame, the person is lovely and beautiful, or something of that nature. And what I would like to think is that our perspectives are determined by something more animalistic, something more sensual. And the true identity of the person is where the humanity lies. what we would call the invariant of the person's identity, where the invariant of the two situations, for example, of the two police officers, the one stationary and the one running, even though their clocks were changing in respect to each other, they had different perspectives in terms of what time it was. The invariant between those two situations was the velocity of light, the law of the constancy of light. You can think of that in a similar manner to humanity, that the invariant in individuals' personalities is something higher than what you're going to gather just on a animalistic perspective of the person, of whether they annoy you or whether they're good looking or whether they entertain you or not. There's something higher that is invariant in that person no matter what situation they're put in or viewed from. And for us, that's the human individual ability to be creative. No matter what perspective a person is viewed from, they're always going to have the ability to be creative, no matter which human being you're looking at. That's an invariant principle in humanity. And so you can take this further into the human science of an economy, where Lyndon LaRouche, he makes fun of people for thinking that money has some sort of absolute value. That if you have $1 million in your pocket, you're automatically rich. But in the historical situation of Weimar Germany, million Reichsmarks would not make you rich. You might be able to buy bread for a second. So the same way people are fixated on their perspectives of personas or their idea of a fixed absolute time, they have that same sort of empirical belief in money, that money has some sort of absolute status, when it's completely variable and dependent on the principles governing your economy. So you see a big difference between what a baby boomer would think of when they think of Einstein's relativity, or what they would say is, whatever, man, it's what you think, it's what I think, we all have our opinions, and they're all equally valid. It's all relative to your own culture, to your own perspective. And they would use Einstein as an excuse to validate it. But instead, it's not relative to your perspective, but there is some invariant principle to which any human mind can discover. And so, in that sense, Einstein's theory of relativity is a theory of the absolute. What is actually absolute, given different reference frames, and that's the laws of nature. One of the immediate questions that comes after dealing with the theory of special relativity, well, okay, so that's pretty incredible. We just dropped absolute time. There's no such thing as a fixed clock outside the universe. We just dropped absolute space. There's no box of space in which we exist in. And we've established that the laws of nature are going to be equally observable given a stationary observer or an observer in uniform motion. And that seems like we accomplished a lot with that theory. But you immediately realize that the situation of uniform motion, of an observer in uniform motion, is rare, to say the least. Or we might say it's infinitesimal in reality. You never have a situation where uniform motion occurs. In reality, most motions can only approximate a uniform motion. Instead, everything is changing, and the way it changes. So the special theory of relativity seems to break down when, on the maglev, you step on the brakes. If you're sitting on that train and somebody steps on the brakes, you're not going to be able to say, oh, I'm stationary and everything else around me is moving, because you're going to fly forward and hit the seat in front of you. The relativity of motion breaks down once you stop moving uniformly, which seems to be the case a lot in reality. So, the special relativity is still Euclidean. It's still a theory dealing with linearity, dealing with non-change. It's only constant motion. If you want a theory of reality, you're going to have to introduce change. And that was the question Einstein immediately jumped on after he made this breakthrough.
Neither space nor time nor matter exist self-evidently. Our senses do not show us the reality outside our skins. They show us a shadow cast by that reality. If you want to make people stupid, make them believe in their senses, because then they won't recognize their own identity. Therefore, to understand the actual meaning of principles of a science of economy, join with Albert Einstein in insisting that matter, space, and time have never actually existed as respectively separate factors in the real universe of our experience, but rather that only the single notion of physical space-time is a competent standard of reference. It is not mathematical statistics which define economy. It is the development and utilization of the creative noetic powers of the individual minds of a society, which is the only competent notion of the idea of economy.
Socially, special relativity would be a form of compassion or self-reflection. Instead of taking for granted the way you view things, think for a moment from a different perspective. Do not assume you are the ultimate reference frame. Put yourself in the shoes of the person next to you. How are they viewing what you're watching right now? What contradicts and what's similar in your two views? Is there something higher bounding the way the two of you think? Think of the time and place in which Einstein was born and how that shaped the way he thought. Or think about how he was able to rise above his contemporaries and think differently and come to new thoughts. Can you step outside yourself to see what's determining how you think? What's the invariant of your identity?
This is my eternally self-same subject, persistent through every change, finding itself once more in every transformation. I can continue the act of apprehending into infinity. This means nothing else than that in endless transformations of my consciousness is self-identical. The entire infinity lies in the unity of my I.
Now think again of Einstein's method of relativity in terms of physical science, with an example Einstein admired. In order for Johannes Kepler to determine the laws governing all the planets, he had to get off of Earth to view what was moving it. He mentally put himself on Mars to view himself back on planet Earth. This was key to figuring out Earth's motion, and hence the invariant which moved all the planets. The face sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other things. Why does this method work for both knowing your own mind, or that of another, and for knowing the causes or reasons in the physical universe? In both cases, you're coming to know a creative mind. One being a human personality, the other being the personal thoughts of the Creator. You're using yourself and the universe as mirrors to view the unseen. This scientific method to life seems to have a history which is accessible to all those who search for it. Would it not be most productive to always engage in this way of thinking? The fact is that this culture of discovery is suppressed. People are told to stick to the cold, hard facts, rely on statistics, and give up on your ability to really know something. That is, stay a creature of your senses. The world can become pretty distracting and discouraging with this type of pressure. Yet Einstein had the courage to expose Newtonian mechanics as a mystical cult, to break with the sacred belief that there are no principles, to ignore the academic demand to conduct science through mathematics without hypotheses. He was not afraid of opposing popularly held conceptions, such as the existence of an absolute time, nor opposing conceptions of his own. He boldly peered into the domain of the unknown, where sense perceptions break down and answers cannot be gathered by simply adding things together, but only through dealing with the most complex relations of thought. How was Einstein able to maintain his focus on truth? How was he, out of the many great minds and diligent professors of the time who were dealing with the same paradox of relativity, able to be the one who made the breakthrough? The same observations and facts were available to all, and there were already theories that all equally well accounted for them. But the cause of these shadows are not self-evident in the facts. You need a perceptive mind to see beyond them. Why was Einstein able to see something new and catch it, while others looked in vain? Where did this instinct to investigate the invisible come from? This genius of a scientist, this theoretical physicist, was guided by his musical intuition. His mind was rooted in a classical identity. No amount of calculating observations made the discovery. Einstein was able to willfully access his creative state of mind through playing his violin.
You see, ultimately even the work of the scholarly researcher comes to fruition in the field of the imagination. When I think back how my discoveries came about and took shape, 100 times one runs into a brick wall to try to hold on to define something which is an unclear feeling floating before you, to bring it into a system, in short, to reach the last summit, in vain. And then, at another time, perhaps like a flash, the resolving thought. And then begins the infinitely exhausting work of constructing and developing the system. This is no different from what happens to an artist. Concentration, extended willpower, years of endurance create a work. That is the temperament required. Mere intuition does not suffice. Artistic premonition plays a not insignificant role in my life. I believe in intuitions and inspirations. I sometimes feel that I am right. I do not know that I am. I am enough of the artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world.
Einstein's son Hans would say of him, whenever he felt that he had come to the end of the road or faced a difficult challenge in his work, he would take refuge in music, and that would solve all his difficulties. The wholly human creation of a musical piece allowed Einstein to get outside the constraints of the accepted rules of thought by reliving the act of discovery and creation of a composer. The tapping into the passion of a continuous classical culture and the exercise of beauty freed Einstein to create an object of thought that he could step back from and view from all sides, a model that aided the synthesis of many relational principles, great in scope, yet still each distinct, into a living integral. In short, music is how Einstein thought.
Since nothing can compel our mind to halt its business, It must be the mind's power of imagination which sets a limit for that activity. In other words, the estimation of magnitude must cease to be logical. It must be achieved aesthetically.
We will see in future installments how this personality holds up, is tested, and is exemplified through 2 world wars, Nazism and McCarthyism, isolation and political attacks, the beginning of a civil rights movement, and the degeneration of both science and culture. What we can learn thus far from Einstein's early life is that truth is not literal, it's ironic. And in human physical science, passion and truth must be united. Passion without scientific reason is wild fantasy, but science without passion, the intense emotion of love or devotion, is robotic practicality. You're left with a collection of useless facts. Because sense perceptions only give you shadows of reality, reality must be sought for in the imagination. Creativity lies in the imagination. To let the mind play and make leaps in thought beyond what you currently know is the function of the domain of art. To watch yourself watching the universe, becoming at once the audience member, the performer, and the composer. In the human drive to more fully comprehend the universals causing phenomena, you turn away from being sense-dominated and practice thinking and acting on the unseen invariant principles which give you a true power in and over the universe. In reflection, you soon see that the higher invariant is the act of your own mind apprehending, and that this resonates with the universe. Every person shares in this ability. You now see the moral conception of the individual identity in a true humanity. This act of discovery, of coming to know and change the world, is a continuous process that does not end with the death of your body, but in fact is passed on generation to generation, giving immortality to ideas and the personalities which discovered them. The question left is, where do you locate your identity?